Greetings and welcome. I'm Dr. Bruce Corrie, Professor of Economics at Concordia University in St. Paul. Thanks for joining today. What I want to share with you is about my work over the past almost 30 years, documenting the economic contributions of the African, Latino, Asian, and Native American communities in Minnesota. You see, when I first came to Minnesota, I found that most of the stories that I've heard or read in the newspaper were about how these African, Latino, Asian, and Native American or Alana people, that they are mainly welfare dependents and criminals and mainly as deficits. And when I looked at the numbers, I found something different. They were actually a very vibrant, important engine for economic growth in Minnesota. And I started thinking about it. Why is it that communities that add the most value, tremendous amount of value, also not given the respect and that basic humanity in this society? And one of the things that came to mind is that the denial of value is a fundamental building block of racism. Because when you deny the value of someone, you can treat them like a commodity and exploit them. And so I began to offer to Minnesota this other vision of looking at the communities as assets. And I want to share with you some of those thoughts and research on the economic contributions of the Alana communities in Minnesota. Especially in recent past couple of years with the COVID and pandemic, we formed the Alana Community Brain Trust, and of people all across Minnesota who thought about ways in which we could build capital and capacity in the Alana communities during these very tough times in our human history. And I've estimated that this Alana economic community in Minnesota, the ethnic economy, is $1.4 trillion. Now, that's a lot of money. As a relative context, the economy of Mexico is smaller than this economic engine in Minnesota. $1.4 trillion. That's a lot of zeros in the number. So how do I come up with a number like $1.4 trillion? What's the basis of it? I want to offer you some of the ways in which I calculated this number. So about 25 billion of it is just the income. That means you take the population times their income from the basic American census data, and you come up with that number. And within this, you find that the people who rent apartments, again, when looking at census data, the number of renters and the average monthly rent, that come up about $175 million they're putting into Minnesota property owners as rent. And then from the survey of business owners, and the best one so far that has both the businesses with and without employees, this was in 2012, so the numbers will be dramatically greater today. But 45,000 businesses with $7 billion, producing $7 billion in goods and services in Minnesota, employing over 60,000 people, and they would be bigger than maybe one of the largest employers in Minnesota as a group. And they also paying annual payroll of about $1.5 billion to other Minnesotans in these businesses. Very, very vibrant engine of economic growth all across Minnesota, from small town to large cities. You'll see these entrepreneurs revitalizing Main Street and the high-tech corridors. And then you have the 500,000 plus workers in the workplace. And this is where I estimate their lifetime earnings to be $1.4 trillion. That means if you take the education level of the worker, high school or college or graduate school, you can project based on some very standard estimates of what would you earn over a lifetime. And so I've used those calculations to come up with this number of $1.4 trillion of lifetime earnings. So that's kind of a huge portfolio of earnings that are paying taxes and generating a lot of economic activity all across Minnesota. And then if you look at the youth in the pre-K to 12 to college education, and if you say if they all of them got a bachelor's degree, that would also indicate a $1.5 trillion in lifetime earnings. So this is apart from the 1.4 trillion I'm talking about. This is the future potential, another 1.5 trillion in our young youth workers. And this ethnic economy generates at least a minimum of $3 billion in taxes annually, in state and local taxes. How do I get that number? Well, the state comes out with the tax incidence study, and it estimates on average Minnesotans pay about 12% in taxes. So that's how I come up with that number. And then you find the global cultural assets that this community brings with their networks all across the world, not only helping us connect to the world, but also bringing that huge wealth into our neighborhoods in all the different cultural assets we see reflected in the ethnic restaurants, for example. And so over the years, I've documented each of the Alana communities, what they contribute to the Minnesota economy as entrepreneurs, as consumers, as businesses, workforce, cultural capital. And these fact sheets are available on my website at empoweringstrategies.org and in other places. I've also done with Dr. Jean Galgaloo of the African Economic Development Solutions and the community partners, one of the most comprehensive studies of the economic contribution of African immigrants, and documented how they play a role in the Minnesota economy. And all of this, as I mentioned to you, is very critical because Minnesota, as Dr. Samuel Myers of the Humphrey Institute says, there's a Minnesota paradox. You have the coexistence of the high quality of life, progressive politics, and innovative programs, and a very diverse economy, but yet one of the worst disparities. And the case, and you could see this reflected institutionally and historically in these redlining maps all across Minnesota, whether it's in Rochester and St. Paul and Minneapolis and Duluth, where the Alana communities were forced to be in some of the worst areas in town, and they could not build long-term generational wealth because of these redlining policies. And this is a very dramatic and very factual footprint of systemic racism in Minnesota. So what is the economic cost of racism? That was what I was asked to estimate by the House Select Committee on Racial Justice, chaired by Representative Rena Moran and Representative Ruth Richardson. And so I looked back and tried to come up with an estimate of the economic cost of racism. And I came up with this estimate of around $280 billion. And this is the gap in income, assets, and lifetime earnings if the Alana communities were on par with the rest of Minnesota. And so this would generate at least a $2 billion annual loss in state-owned revenue. So another way of looking at this, if you flipped it, if Minnesota had racial parity and equality, Minnesota's economy would increase by $287 billion. That's a lot of economic activity that can happen to Minnesota. And so again, how do I come up with this $287 billion? As I mentioned, I went and estimated the loss in income and the loss in lifetime earnings and the loss in business revenue and the loss in home ownership and And all of that, putting it together, came up with that estimate. And so one might ask, so what's the best way to address racial disparity? And through this process, we in the Alana Brain Trust offer the Minnesota solution of shared sustainable prosperity. And basically, the elements of that is view our communities, the Alana communities, as this 1.4 trillion asset, not as a deficit, as an asset. Look at people as assets and put the person at the center of our economic development effort and operate with cultural intelligence, because different communities have different life experiences and lived experiences, and important to integrate that into our policies and programs and empower the individuals to effectively engage with their social, economic, institutional, and personal environments. But you also need a series of sustained long-term investments to leverage and grow this $1.4 trillion economy. And so we need comprehensive strategies that go beyond giving a person a fish, teaching someone how to fish, building the capacity to fish, providing a place to fish, helping develop a new fish, but ultimately transforming the fishing industry. And so this investments that we asked for was in these wealth-building infrastructures, such as business incubators and community development organizations and land trusts and asset building, different kinds of capital in every neighborhood. Alana communities, if they have access to it, they would be successful. And we made the case initially for $1 billion economic development fund that could fund these assets in the economy, but also with this huge $9 billion or $9 to $12 billion surplus, we asked that take 20%, because that's about the Alana population in Minnesota. Take 20% of the $9 billion surplus, and that's about $2 billion, and put it into well-building infrastructures, long-term investments. Unfortunately, that has not happened. And so we need to invest in this wonderful, important asset that is in Minnesota, in the Alana communities, not just this wealth building strategy that I'm focusing on as an economist, because that ultimately builds up community, but also the other dimensions of our humanity, the human relationships and community. And it's well summarized in the Alana Brain Trust called shared sustainable prosperity. Shared because everyone has to benefit from the economic development process, and it should be sustainable not only in terms of the environment, but also in terms of continuing the future. And then there should be prosperity for all, because if the boat doesn't rise, others will not benefit too. And so we have to have an intentional progress for doing so. So thanks for listening, and till next time, have a great Minnesota day.